this is the moment where the promise of God really kicks in terms of Mary's story, as the angel Gabriel arrives to bring from God the message that she's to carry, to be the bearer of God's presence in the form of his son, Jesus, and comes to be known in Christian tradition as the God-bearer because of this moment. Not without some pushback, I have to say, from Mary, because she asks, how can this be? Because she's a virgin still. And it's a scene known as the Annunciation, and it's the subject of by far the longest section of the New Testament narratives that is devoted to Mary. It's particularly in the Gospel of Luke, where we get a whole sequence of events described in considerable detail about how Mary both receives this message, becomes pregnant, and then a series of other things to do with her pregnancy and the eventual birth. So these are some of the most important biblical episodes that are devoted to Mary.
This is a quite special and unusual representation of the Annunciation in that it's very early. It was probably carved around the year 1000 in Germany, and it probably served at one point as the cover of a manuscript. And I really like this idea that this subject marks the beginning of a really important, crucial part of Mary's life, and it also, as a book cover, is the beginning of that story. It's unusual in a number of ways, one in which, when we often see the Annunciation, it takes place in a domestic interior. Instead, here we have the angel Gabriel on the left, the Virgin Mary here on the right, in a kind of landscape setting, which is only really suggested by these curious pebbles that they're standing on. And of course, the most dominant aspect of this composition is the tree at its center.
That's very striking, isn't it? And seems to me immediately provokes us to think back to perhaps the most famous biblical tree, which was the tree in the Garden of Eden, from which Eve and Adam ate the fruit, and which is in Christian tradition known as the moment of the fall, when humanity disobeys God, and they're cast out from paradise, and all the misery and sadness and cruelty of the world unfolds as a result. And in some sense, this is a moment of perfect obedience by Mary, as a sort of counterpart, as many Christian theologians have read it over the centuries, a sort of counterpart of Eve. She's like a new Eve, but precisely doing the mirror image of what Eve did, the opposite, by saying, yes, your will is something I will obey. And in some ways, therefore, she becomes even the redeemer of Eve herself. And in some sense, too, the new mother of all living people. So she's described in those terms, those capacious terms, as, just as Eve was, a new beginning for the whole of creation and all its inhabitants.
It's interesting what you say about new beginnings, because that reminds me that this event is often celebrated every year, even to this day, on March 25th. That is, of course, 9 months before Christmas, Christ's birth. And in many countries for centuries, that actually marked the beginning of the new year. So this is the beginning of Mary's next part of her story, the beginning of this book, and the beginning of the new year.
And there's something else the angel says, which is a piece of information for Mary, some news for her. Well, not quite as big news as the news that she's going to carry this child, but the news that her kinswoman, Elizabeth, who lives in the hill country nearby, is also pregnant. And Mary, very shortly after this, goes to visit her. And that's what we're going to look at in our next film.
On the Visitation.